Welcome back to another episode of Tuba People TV, where we talk about Arnold Jacobs all of the time. Puddles and I are here to introduce another podcast. This was done some years ago when we were down in Florida to interview Eric Lee. Eric asked if it would be okay if he interviewed us, and Puddles was a little disagreeable at first, but his feathers were somewhat ruffled, but we said okay. And so it was a part of the Space Coast Symphony series of podcasts, and Eric has kindly given me the MP3 audio file for this podcast, from that podcast, and talking about Mr. Jacobs, of course, and we hope you enjoy it. So please enjoy this podcast about Mr. Jacobs.
No show would be complete without one of our featured interviews, correct?
Well, that's correct. Let me set that up for you. Our interview today is a friend of mine, Mike Grose. He's currently the tuba professor at the University of Oregon. We went to school together at Northwestern University. And what happened was he's doing this project where he's interviewing all the...
A project.
It is a project.
Okay.
He's doing like this project where he's interviewing all the former students of Arnold Jacobs. Now, our listeners, some may be aware, but Arnold Jacobs was the tuba player in the Chicago Symphony Orchestra and probably the preeminent brass teacher of the 20th century.
Wow.
So,
that's some title, preeminent brass teacher of the 20th century.
Actually, you could even say maybe like wind teacher, because more than just brass players. I mean, he... taught like all like wind instruments. People would come in, and work with him. But I mean, I think primarily is like,
And was this at DePaul where you went?
Well, he taught it towards the end of my time at Northwestern, and then when I went to DePaul, they worked a special deal for me so I could study with Jacobs, even though I was going to DePaul. So, but he was, really a great teacher. So what Mike is doing is he's going around and interviewing all of the former students he can, and he's doing like a little video. And then when we get that, we'll put that on the website as like additional content. Say hello to our audience, Michael.
Eric, it is so good to see you. I can't believe it. And hello to everybody who's listening.
Mike found, I'm a curmudgeon. I'm not on Facebook, but...
Taking me 20 years to find you, Eric.
I know, and I didn't...
20 years.
I didn't realize I was this hard to find. But we're out here. Mike is on vacation here in Florida. He's at a beautiful resort out in Kissimmee. We're sitting on his balcony looking at the pool, so that's the water you have in the background. And I'm just so happy that Mike found me. And the main reason he found me was he's doing this project that he's going to elaborate about on our mutual teacher, Arnold Jacobs. Arnold Jacobs was the tuba player in the Chicago Symphony Orchestra and probably wouldn't you say, the foremost brass teacher of...
I'd say the 20th century?
20th century.
Yeah,
if not all time.
Well, I think...
next to you, of course, associate professor at the University of Oregon.
Yeah, no, I don't...
Go Ducks.
Yeah, go Ducks. I can buy in Go Ducks. Yeah. Certainly Jacobs, certainly the 20th century, and maybe of all time. I think Arbonne would be somebody you'd probably talk about in terms of the 19th century.
Right.
But he definitely changed the direction of wind teaching or wind pedagogy, as we say in the academy.
Right.
In a much different direction than it had been taking prior to his teaching.
Exactly.
But what a guy he was. What an amazing person. Right.
Really, really incredible. Mike is doing... Why don't you tell our listeners about the project you're doing?
Sure.
And then we'll talk a little bit, about you as well.
I'd rather talk about you, Eric.
Well,
about me,
we can
more
talk
about you.
We can talk about that too. We've got about a half hour, so we can tear it up.
But about 2.5 years ago, I embarked on a project that I thought would be really interesting, but I had no idea just how interesting it would be. At least for me, it's been really an amazing project to be a part of. Essentially, what I started to do was to go around the world and interview former students of Arnold Jacobs. And the reason being that Arnold Jacobs, as was mentioned before, is really just an amazing wind teacher, brass teacher in particular. He was the tuba player of the Chicago Symphony from 1944 to 1988, and just a landmark teacher. And his as the years go by, then many, every year, some of his students pass away. I'm really happy to have interview examples of his teaching from the students who studied with him in the 40s, the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, and the 90s.
Right.
So it's quite a long number of decades representing his teaching. And today we just got to add Mr. Eric Lee to the interview list.
Right. We'll have a copy of the video. You're on the website. It's very high tech. Mike's got a great production studio here in Florida. So
one of my many, yeah.
Yeah. So it's really top notch. So.
All of these interviews are posted on the YouTube channel Tuba People TV. It's all one word. You can go to YouTube and see all of these interviews at Tuba People TV.
Did you start at Northwestern?
I transferred in 1981. I had completed 2 years of study at a community college in the Portland, Oregon area, Clark Community College, and then a year of study at Portland State University.
Okay.
And a friend of mine from high school, a trombone player, I had kept in contact with him. He had gone to Northwestern as a trombone
student. Who was that?
Daniel McCarthy.
Oh, yeah, Dan McCarthy.
I got to meet you in 1981. That was great. Peter Dubois.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we had a really good class.
Yeah, it was great.
And the nice thing about Northwestern was it's not a big school, so I think at the very most there were maybe 10 tuba players.
Yeah,
at the most. So it's really good. Everybody got along good.
Yeah.
It was and that's counting graduate students. Maybe like 10 tubas with graduate students and everybody.
Norm Hansen.
Yeah, well, he's a trombone player.
And a euphonium player.
Euphonium.
Yeah.
He's a really good euphonium player.
Yeah, very good.
I think he's in teaching in Indiana.
He is?
Yeah.
He's a Facebook friend of mine, but you're not on Facebook.
I may have to switch. My friend Bob Gloppin, he said, if Eric of Tuba were to get on Facebook, the servers would shut down. So I'm actually trying to keep Zuckerberg in business, not shut it down. But I might actually think, get on it.
Okay.
So we'll see.
All right.
So,
good.
So then did you study with Mr. Jacobs right away? Because he wasn't officially on the faculty at that point.
Well, in 1981, it's an interesting thing. I knew nothing of Arnold Jacobs when I applied to Northwestern. I only applied to Northwestern. There were two reasons. One, my band director in high school says if you want to make it big in your hometown, then you have to leave town and get the secret sauce from somebody else, somewhere else, and come back with the secret sauce. Or at least that's the way you'll be perceived. You may not get anything from where you go, but you'll be perceived as having some secret sauce that everybody will want.
Right. Well, and plus Chicago is like a mecca for brass players.
Of course. I mean, obviously there was secret sauce, but it didn't really matter. The main thing was going away. So when I auditioned, I went up to Stadium High School in Tacoma, Washington, and played for the microphone for the tape recorder in spring of '81. Jim Moore, who was the admissions director at the time, he said, "Now, you know that Bob Rusk is our tuba teacher," and I said, "Who's Bob Rusk?" And he said, "Well, I just want to make sure you knew that Arnold Jacobs was not our tuba teacher." And I said, "Well, who's Arnold Jacobs?" I had no idea. He said, "That's all I needed to hear." Okay, thank you very much. So I got to meet Bob Rusk, when I arrived in September of '81, and then that very year they brought Jacobs back in a part-time capacity. So we studied with Jacobs and Rusk concurrently.
Right, because I had started studying with him on my own when I was a sophomore, and then I remember he got back on the faculty. And what our listeners may not realize was Northwestern is in Evanston, which is like the first northern suburb of Chicago. And then Mr. Jacobs taught in the Fine Arts Building, which was just down the street from Orchestra Hall on Michigan Avenue.
Downtown Chicago.
In downtown Chicago. And he didn't want to drive up to Evanston to have to, teach. And he lived on the south side of Chicago.
Yeah, like 100 south.
Way down there.
So it would have been just a terrible drive for him to drive from South Chicago to North.
Right.
Side.
Because then how old was he?
He was 65 in 1981.
Yeah, see? So he was, already... But then he played didn't retire till 88.
So he was... he retired when he was 83. No, 73.
Right, because he retired in 88.
Yeah, exactly.
And then he lived another...
10 years.
Right, 98, so...
But it was great. Wasn't it great studying with Jake and with Bob Rusk?
Yeah. And now another thing our listeners may not realize, Bob Rusk was the tuba player in the Milwaukee Symphony. And we were talking about this, off the air, what an underrated tuba teacher and player he was. I mean, he was really, really great. I thought a really great teacher.
Yeah, fantastic.
And he was
teacher.
a long-time student of Jacobs. Plus, he studied with Bill Bell. At Indiana.
I tell you, that first lesson I had with Jacobs was just an amazing one. It was, I had been taught in very honest ways. All the teachers that I encountered as a tuba player, I thought were giving me their very best. And they were, and some of them are still living, are really great people, and I admire them, and I keep in touch with them. But it was the pedagogy of, the 19th century.
Right.
And it was getting to Jacobs was just amazing because it was based upon how we function as human beings and not anecdotally how a particular teacher functions who's teaching the student in front of him. And so it was really Jacobs was able to get into the mind of the person sitting with him in the studio and affect change really rapidly and radically.
Exactly.
And my very first lesson with him, I remember thinking to myself, it's just one of these surreal moments.
That's kind of what we talked about on the
TV side of things.
Right, because we did the video
TV.
before we did this. I mean, that's kind of the thing. At the beginning, it is surreal. You're with Arnold Jacobs. You're not with, Joe Blow.
No.
I mean, you're at the top at that point.
And Peter Dubois, who was my floor mate in college, we were in the same dorm at Kendall College. We were off-site. We weren't in a Northwestern dorm.
That's because you were an elusive
transfer student.
Right.
Exactly. Peter was very kind to take me down to Michigan Avenue and take me up to see Jake's studio. He explained to me who Arnold Jacobs was and all that kind of stuff. And so when I finally got into the studio, I certainly then knew who he was. I had an idea of who he was. But I didn't, it was just an amazing thing. When I was in that lesson, I had one of these out-of-body conversations with myself while he's teaching me. So if you can imagine, the audio to Arnold Jacobs is going down and the audio to my conversation, my self-conversation is increasing.
Exactly.
And I'm saying to myself, wow, this is not as hard as it is, as I've made it out to be. It's actually pretty easy to play the tuba.
Well, that's what was really the whole thing. He did make it easy.
Made it easy.
Because basically he would make his whole philosophy, song and wind.
Yeah.
You had like this little tuba in your head, and the big tuba is just a reflection of the little tuba.
Right.
And you get it in your mind, and then it just comes out.
Jacobs was really concerned more with what the student was thinking when they made a mistake. Were they having their thoughts on the music, or were their thoughts elsewhere?
Right.
And if their thoughts were elsewhere, then it becomes a matter of controlling your thoughts.
Right, and then just bringing, the music in, and then bringing it, because basically you have the music in your head, and that makes your lip do what it needs to do.
Yeah.
And then you have enough air behind it, so you have the fuel to make it happen.
Yeah. It was the perfect storm. Yeah. It really was, because you had Jacobs, who arrived 3 or 4 years before Bud. Bud arrived, and then they had this period of time in the Chicago Symphony in the late 40s where they didn't have a music director, and so they were more or less like kids in a candy store. They were able to really do what they wanted with a little bit of restraint.
A little bit.
Once in a while. And then you get into the 1950s. Kubelik had come and gone, and then Reiner showed up.
Right.
With his RCA contract.
Right.
And you had this amazing brass section that had been percolating for the last 5 or 6 or 7 years. Reiner shows up and with his recording contract with RCA, and then all of a sudden they make these amazing recordings, incredible recordings, that many of which are still gold standard today, even 50, 60 years later.
Right, and they would do those in Orchestra Hall, and that was before the hall was remodeled, and basically you would just hang like one micro, like a stereo just from the top, and that was it.
Well, that was the Mercury Living
Presence.
Presence.
That was the mono.
Yeah, that was
the mono.
mono.
But then RCA was stereo, but I mean, it was
stereo.
Like
it wasn't a lot of over-miking, you're right.
No, it was amazing. And if you listen to, going back to Kubelik, like the pictures in an exhibition recording with Kubelik, you've got, like you said, they're like a bunch of young kids.
That was Bud Herseth's first commercial recording. That was the first time that we get to hear Bud on a commercial recording. It was an amazing time for that orchestra.
Right, and then you had after Reiner, and then the other interesting about Reiner was Jake's conductor at Curtis.
That's right, and Jacobs there wasn't necessarily, I don't think there was a committee per se, but a few people were. Like Bud Herseth, Jacobs, I think the concertmaster was asked by management what they thought of Fritz Reiner possibly becoming the next music director, and Jacobs is famous for quoting, "Oh, I'm sure he's calmed down in his elder years. I'm sure it'll be fine."
I don't know if that really happened.
I don't think that happened.
Yeah. He would tell me, like in lessons, like anytime Reiner was around, you would only practice like your best stuff. And you the hardest excerpts you could play, perfectly, and then he'd leave you alone in rehearsal.
Yeah, and he learned that at Curtis because his practice room, his assigned practice room, Mr. Jacobs' assigned practice room at Curtis Institute of Music in Philadelphia was on the corridor that led from one part of the building to the other part of the building. And so he had, he knew that all the great artists of the Philadelphia Orchestra were coming, walking past. He knew the conducting staff would be walking past. So he said instinctively he knew he had to sound great all the time.
Right.
And that's what he would call training the brain or programming the brain to sound great all the time.
Right.
So even if he had to change the rules by slowing things down or taking things up an octave or down an octave, whatever it might have been.
Right.
Whatever he had to do to sound great, he always found a way to sound great.
Right. And then that's kind of like what he would talk about in the lessons too.
Yeah.
You don't want to practice sounding bad.
Right.
You only want to practice sounding good. So whatever you're playing, the most elemental piece, like how they are, whatever, you want to sound your best at all the times. You never want to sound bad.
Always good.
Right. And, because he didn't Reiner, coming after him. Because Reiner, was, kind of a tyrant, don't you think?
Kind of.
Yeah,
So what was it? One of the horn players, after Reiner passed away, one of the horn players went to the funeral service, and somebody asked, "Why? I didn't think you liked Dr. Reiner well enough to go to his funeral service." And the horn player said, "I didn't. I just want to make sure he was dead." There was this bass player, and this is before the musicians union was particularly strong in terms of the orchestral side of things. It was strong in the dance band side of things, at that time, but not so much in the orchestra world. There weren't as many protections for the musicians back then. And so there was this bass player who in the orchestra, Chicago Symphony, who would be, from time to time asking Reiner about his beat pattern, or can you make that more clear, or can you, I can't really tell what you're doing. And one day the bass player started bringing binoculars to rehearsal, and so one time he held up the binoculars to see the beat pattern, and Reiner caught that, and so the next time Reiner was prepared, and so the next day or the next week, whenever it might have been, that bass player brought binoculars and used them. Reiner had a little note in his hand that
you're fired.
It said you're fired. so as the bass player was looking through the binoculars at his baton, he could see the note that said you're fired.
Oh, see, I don't think I had heard that story. That's a great story.
That's a good one.
Well, Jacobs used to tell me what a small beat, you just had to be on your game.
Absolutely.
All the time.
Yeah, very, very, very economical use of a baton. And when you go back and look at the videos of Reiner conducting, I'm sure they're on YouTube, and there's the VAI put out several DVDs, one of which of the Chicago Symphony, one of which has Reiner. You can see just how economical he was. I mean, he could certainly get big if he wanted to, but he was generally pretty plain. Right.
But then in the late 60s, then Schulte came, and then everything.
Oh, my gosh. Talk about the polar opposite of beat pattern.
Exactly.
Wow.
But just I think personality in general, too. I don't think...
More outgoing. Yeah, Schulte was much more outgoing.
Right, I don't think the players... I never heard Jacobs say anything bad about Schulte.
I don't think they weren't scared of losing their jobs with Schulte as they were with Reiner. I think at that point, the orchestra had such an esprit de corps that they were the Chicago Symphony now, and they wanted to sound great all the time.
Right, and our listeners may not realize what we're talking about. Like in the 50s, it wasn't even a full-time job back then. Chicago Symphony.
It was like a 25 or 30 week downtown winter season, maybe 25 weeks, and then you'd have maybe a month or 6 weeks off, and then you'd have a 4-week summer season at Ravinia, and then you'd have another 4, 5, 6 weeks off, and then you'd start the downtown season again.
Right, it wasn't even a full-time job. I mean, Jacobs told me he made more money playing upright bass in CBS than he did with the Chicago Symphony, because he doubled, played bass.
on string bass. And he also would play in the tea room or the restaurant at Marshall Fields on State Street. He'd play in a jazz trio.
Right.
But Herseth sold used cars to supplement his income.
Right. Yeah, it was a different time.
It was a different time. And Bob Rada, who's one of the people I interviewed, he actually studied with Jacobs in the 40s. He joined the Chicago Symphony trombone section in the 50s under Reiner. He was there, I think, maybe 5 years, and decided, I can make more money doing something else.
Right.
And so he went into aeronautics.
Right.
And, left the orchestra.
Right. It's a totally different world, than it is now.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it was not a 52-week season. It wasn't until the early 60s that the musicians in the orchestras in the United States, the big ones, started to take control of their destiny through the unions, because the local unions at that time were much more focused on the dance band members of their locals, and as well as the recordings, the recordings. And so there was not as much attention paid to the orchestral musicians. And so the orchestral musicians in these various cities, Chicago, Cleveland, Philadelphia, New York, would be more or less left out in the cold by the representation or lack thereof they were getting from the local union boards when they would negotiate contracts with the symphony managements or the symphony boards.
Right.
And so it wasn't until the 60s when the orchestral musicians started to gain control of the local boards through the election process. They would get themselves elected onto these executive boards, and then they have much more control over the whole negotiating processes that was going on. And then we see the 52-week contract. The first 52-week contract, I think, came with Cleveland Orchestra in the early 60s, and So it's just a much different time back in the 50s. Much different. And, there's the famous recording session, the Heldenleben with Reiner recording session.
Right. You're talking about the first one. The one what was that, 54?
Well, they only did it once. They only did it Heldenleben. They did
Zarathustra
twice.
Right.
But Heldenleben, it wasn't like this all-day, 12-hour session. Mm-hmm. And, you can hear Bud is really playing on his teeth.
Yeah.
On the second half of that piece, the last third of that piece, Bud Herseth. And he still sounds amazing, just mind over matter.
Right.
But still, they didn't have the work rules back then.
Right.
And when they got done with that Heldenleben, they said, "Hey, let's record Salome dances too." And so they did. So it was like this 12-hour recording session day, which is just crazy.
Yeah, it's unbelievable. And that's kind of in the teaching. Jacobs would talk about that too, how it's mind over matter. Your lip, it doesn't even matter what it feels like. It's just, some skin flapping in the wind. It doesn't matter what it feels like or anything. It's all in your head. In my
interview with Luis Lubriel, he talked about one of his early lessons with Jacobs, where Luis, trumpet player, went in and Jacobs just had him playing for like 30 minutes. Mm-hmm. And what Jacobs was trying to do was get Luis fatigued to find out, once he's fatigued, where is his mind then?
Right.
And because he was sounding good going into the lesson, but where will he be in 30 minutes if
he starts going downtown?
Put him through his paces and let him play all this hard rep. Where is his mind going to be once his lips start to feel uncomfortable?
Right.
And that's Luis talked about that in his interview about how it's the more uncomfortable your lips become feeling, that's when you have to turn up the sound in your head even louder. Thanks again to Eric Lee and his lovely interviewing skills. We had a great time on the veranda of our timeshare next to the pool, talking about Mr. Jacobs. We hope you enjoyed it. And now, back to you.